Thank you. Before I begin this evening, I want to put my thanks in as well to Dr. Diefendorf, Dr. Hiller, and all of his colleagues here for inviting me to come here and speak with you tonight, and for being such gracious hosts in the short time that I've been here in Durham. I felt extremely welcome from both staff and students. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here this evening. I want to make just a note before I begin my talk that the individuals I'll be discussing this evening, I'll be using a series of case studies, and these individuals' names have been anonymized. They've been changed to protect the privacy of those individuals and of their families, so keep that in mind as I go on this evening. Ida and Sophie Benz were sisters, born to a local Lutheran pastor and his wife in the village of Haslach, Bavaria. Sophie, born in 1861, and Ida, just 18 months later, had a normal upbringing as ministers' daughters, and remaining unmarried, moved to the Swabian city of Augsburg, where they shared an apartment. Their brother, who was also a clergyman like their father, saw to their needs through their mutual inheritance, and as the sisters reached their advanced years, he arranged that the two of them be lodged together in the city's Paulinenstift, a retirement home belonging to the Lutheran Church. On the evening of the 25th and 26th of February 1944, Allied aircraft launched a first massive bombing raid on the city of Augsburg. British bombers who were landing from their sorties reported that the air attack almost completely destroyed the city center, and German news media, after the bombing raid had ended, reported the destruction of several residential neighborhoods. During the night, the Paulinenstift residence was heavily damaged in the bombardment and in the fires that raged in its wake. Among the frightened and disoriented inhabitants evacuated that evening were Ida and Sophie Benz. As their brother himself was now living in a nursing home and could not come to collect them and take them in, local German Red Cross officials placed the two sisters on a transport of elderly individuals bound for the sanatorium Kaufbeuren, 30 kilometers to the south. Ida and Sophie arrived at the mental health facility on 27 February, where Kaufbeuren personnel recorded that their committal was due, quote, to a bombing raid on the city of Augsburg. The sisters were diagnosed upon admission with senile dementia. Nurses noted that their illness dated from 25 February 1944, the night of the bombing. Ida, the younger of the siblings, seemed particularly confused and frightened upon arrival, and her sister Sophie, more composed, decided she would stay with her in order to care for her. In subsequent days, caretakers observed that Ida was still exhibiting marked disorientation, and in her terror continued to soil her bed. 5 months later, Ida was dead. Sophie, alone and unclaimed by family members, remained at the facility for another year. On the 5th of April, 1945, she died, perhaps as a result of systematic starvation, just 2 weeks before American troops arrived in the region. Both Ida and Sophie Benz number among the hundreds of victims murdered at the Kaufbeuren facility as a result of the Nazis' so-called euthanasia effort. And as soon as I get my mouse turned around here, there we go. A measure which aimed to restore the racial integrity of the German nation, the euthanasia program sought to eliminate what Nazi authorities deemed, as Jeffrey has said, life unworthy of life. Individuals who, because of severe psychiatric, neurological, or physical disabilities, might be regarded as what the Nazis described as human ballast, whose institutional care imposed a burden upon German society and the state. The effort was a National Socialist regime's first program of mass murder, preceding the final solution of the genocide of European Jewry by approximately 2 years, and it was an important forerunner to that much more systematic mass murder campaign. In the spring and summer months of 1939, a number of planners, led by Philip Buhler, there we go, there he is, who was the director of Hitler's private chancellery, the Führer Chancellery, and Karl Brandt, who was Hitler's attending physician, began to organize a secret killing operation targeting disabled children. On 18 August 1939, the Reich Interior Ministry circulated a decree compelling all physicians and midwives to report newborn infants and toddlers under the age of 3 who showed signs of severe mental or physical disability. At first, only infants and toddlers were incorporated in this child euthanasia measure, but as the scope of the measure widened, juveniles up to the age of 17 were included in the killing. Conservative estimates suggest, and I think this is a rather low estimate, that 5,000 to 7,000, and I want to point out these are German Aryan children for the most part, 5,000 to 7,000 physically and mentally disabled children were murdered at 30 to 35 specially designated children's killing wards through starvation or through lethal overdose of medication in Nazi Germany. By 1940, an adult killing operation paralleled the murder of disabled German infants and children, codenamed Operation T4. The effort took its name from this building and from its street address, its central office in Berlin's Tiergartenstrasse 4, a very posh part of Berlin, near the center of the city. And today, if you've ever been to Berlin, it's in the courtyard of where the Berlin Philharmonic now stands. It was an Aryanized villa. It was a villa which was taken away from its Jewish owners and was destroyed during the war years. So, utilizing a practice that had already been developed for child euthanasia, T4 planners began in the autumn of 1939 to distribute carefully formulated questionnaires to all public health officials, to public and private hospitals, to mental institutions and nursing homes for the chronically ill and aged. The limited space and wording on the form tried to suggest that this form was meant to garner statistical data. The form's sinister purpose was suggested only by the emphasis which the questionnaire placed upon the patient's, that individual's, capacity to work, and by the categories of patients whom medical directors of various facilities were required to register with public health authorities. Those suffering from severe psychiatric or physical disabilities, those not of non-German or non-German related blood. You can read here Jews. About 5,000 Jews also died in this euthanasia program, which targeted mainly German Aryan patients. Those committed to mental health facilities on criminal grounds, in other words, people who had committed crimes under diminished capacity, and those who had been confined in the institution in question for more than 5 years. So they're looking for long-term disabled patients. These registration forms were reviewed by teams of specially appointed medical experts, many of them of significant reputation in the medical community, who were recruited especially for this secret campaign. And beginning in January of 1940, those persons whom those physicians, specially selected, selected themselves for inclusion to the euthanasia program were transported to one of eventually 6 killing centers throughout Germany and Austria, to Brandenburg on the Havel, about an hour outside of Berlin, to Grafeneck in the Swabian Alb in southwestern Germany, to Bernburg and Sonnenstein-Pirna, right outside of Dresden, both of these in the heart of industrial Saxony in the east, to Linz, to Hartheim, the institution was called, in Linz on the Danube, in what was then annexed Austria. Austria had by this time been annexed to the German Reich, and finally Hadamar in Hessen-Nassau near Frankfurt. Within hours of their arrival at these facilities, patients were gassed with carbon monoxide gas, their dental gold was removed, and their bodies incinerated in specially designed gas chambers, in specially designed crematory ovens, According to T4's own internal statistics, 70,273 mentally and physically disabled persons, patients mainly, perished at these 6 gassing installations between January 1940 and August 1941. Because this program was a secret one, a clandestine program, occurring on German soil indeed, elaborate efforts were taken to conceal its deadly designs. Although in every case, official records were falsified to indicate that the victims in each case had died of natural causes, the euthanasia program quickly became an open secret. This is a clandestine photo taken by an inhabitant of Heberer, a small village below the hill of the town which housed the psychiatric facility. And just to give you a kind of feeling for the kind of knowledge that was prevalent among the local population, the farmers in this district, it was a heavily agricultural district, had sued the local agricultural chamber which controlled their agricultural activities because the smoke from the crematoria, the ash from the crematoria, was ruining their crops. So this became, as I say, a kind of open secret. And fearing public unrest at this very critical time in the war effort, in June of that year, in 1941, Germany had just invaded the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler himself gave orders to halt this T4 gassing operation in August 24th of 1941. And for roughly 1 year, the adult euthanasia hung in a kind of stasis. It halted killing operations. The child euthanasia program continued as before. And during this time, during this year of kind of stasis, over 100 T4 functionaries were recruited by the planners of the final solution to serve as the German personnel in the camps Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These names might be familiar to you. They're commonly called extermination camps. Treblinka, probably the most known of those three camps. 800,000 Jews were murdered there alone. It was the final station for the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto. Those three camps alone claimed the lives of 1.5 million Jews. And T4 personnel were the core of the German personnel at those three camps until those camps were liquidated in the autumn of 1943. So there's an important connection between this earlier mass murder campaign and the much more systematic murder, which was the final solution. In the summer months of 1942, the killing of adult institutionalized patients resumed on German soil. More decentralized than this initial gassing phase, these renewed euthanasia efforts were still choreographed in Berlin. The T4 Central Office, which we've just seen in the photograph a little bit before, continued to select and transport and process its victims, while the local authorities, usually the doctors on the ground, asserted their own priorities and determined the pace of the local killing effort in their facilities. This second phase of euthanasia killings took place at a broad range of custodial settings of mental health institutions, mainly throughout the German Reich. The majority of these institutions that were now pressed into service served at once as a killing center and then again as a normal sanatorium for mentally and physically disabled persons, so that in each case, that murder process had to fit within that facility's daily regimen for healing, and in this case also for killing. In an attempt to more carefully camouflage the murders at these euthanasia sites, adult euthanasia centers now introduced a different kind of killing method, employing the much more successful method of using overdoses of medication and sometimes to starvation, which had been successfully applied in the child euthanasia program. They began to murder their patients in this way. There was one final important difference which distinguished the second murder phase from the first years of euthanasia which took place during that gassing action. In those first years, in 1940 and 1941, the T4 motto was that the gas valve belongs in the hand of the physician, right? They're medicalizing the killing, just as they do later at Auschwitz when they employ doctors on the ramp and doctors to apply the Cyclone B to the gas chambers. But what's equally true between 1942 and 1945 is that the syringe or the medication, the lethal overdose of medication, now belongs in the hands of the nurses who are murdering patients on the night shift in most of those hospitals. And that was the practice that was run roughly from 1942 to 1945. So now every sector of these facilities, whether you're administrators, doctors, or nurses, are taking part in the killing process. The euthanasia program continued to claim victims until the very end of the Nazi regime in May 1945 and beyond, as we'll see. And usually, I think these estimates are rather low, but most historians cite the figure of 200,000 to 250,000 individuals ultimately claimed by the euthanasia program and its corollaries between 1939 and 1945. And this sort of historical assessment of this rather understudied Nazi policy remains dynamic, a kind of work in progress. Since the 1980s, when German researchers like Hans-Walter Schmuhl, Ernst Clay, Friedrich Karl Kaul began to attract scholarly attention, it's really in the 1980s that the euthanasia studies began to take off. The contours of T4 policy have been pretty solidly delineated, yet our knowledge of the euthanasia operation remains imperfect. Until recently, little scholarly attention has focused on reconstructing the lives and experiences of euthanasia victims. A preoccupation with the overarching murder campaign, the murder operation, how that operation worked in many places, has worked to overshadow the individual experiences of euthanasia victims and to obscure their identities. Documentation is difficult. Many patient files have been destroyed, while German privacy laws ensure that the bulk of these medical records remain sealed or inaccessible to scholars. And I'm just going to skip ahead so we can see the the Kaufbeuren facility, which I'm going to discuss in just a moment. Recent research among people who are working in this field are now trying to fill the gaps in this kind of knowledge, fill in the lacunae regarding euthanasia victims. In the year 2000, the Kaufbeuren Regional Hospital, which to the horror of many of the people that I tell this story to is still a functioning mental health facility, granted access of its extant wartime patient records to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Archive, my institution in Washington. And the resulting record group that we received from the Kaufbeuren institution contains the patient files of roughly 1,500 individuals, the vast majority of whom died at the Kaufbeuren facility you see here behind me during the war years. And based on 500 samples, so far I've been through 500 of these patient files. So this presentation is a kind of preliminary victim composite for those individuals who lived and died at the facility. And such an exploration kind of helps us to reconstruct something we really haven't seen before, and that's the lives, the daily lives of patients living and dying at these facilities, and sort of refracted, if you will, kind of through a glass darkly, seen really through the writings and records of the medical and administrative staff and their patient records. These files allow us finally a glimpse of these individuals, who they were besides being euthanasia victims, and what they suffered at the hands of the doctors and nurses and their staffs that were supposed to, of course, take care of this very vulnerable patient population. Kaufbeuren, again, the facility you see behind me, began its tenure as a sanatorium and a long-term care unit in the region of Swabia. I'm going to move this down a little bit, is that all right? So that I don't make such hissy noises when I speak. There we go. That should be a little better. It began its tenure as a sanatorium in Swabia, an area of southwestern Germany, in 1876. Under the direction of euthanasia operative Valentin Fodelhauser, he was chief medical administrator of this institution since 1929. Kaufbeuren began its direct collaboration with the euthanasia program with the establishment of a children's killing ward there in December of 1941. By late May 1945, 209 infants, toddlers, and juveniles had been murdered at the facility. The practice of adult euthanasia began at Kaufbeuren in 1943 and gained momentum really in the following year. Death registers from Kaufbeuren revealed that approximately 1,350 adults died at the facility directly as a result of the euthanasia program. Hundreds of other patients had been moved during the gassing period to one of the centralized killing centers that you saw from 1940 to 1941 and had been murdered there as well. So the death toll is actually much higher among Kaufbeuren patients than what I'm going to explain tonight. Among euthanasia facilities, Kaufbeuren possesses a particularly notorious reputation for two reasons. First, because it was one of several Bavarian sanatoria for which murder through systematic starvation was secret state policy. In addition to killing patients through lethal overdoses of medication like luminol, veronal, morphine, scopolamine solution, which was very common for killing patients in the euthanasia program, Kaufbeuren patients died lingering deaths by the so-called Holocaust, or starvation regimen. Second, Kaufbeuren was shocking proof to post-war authorities of the ingrained nature of the killing process among euthanasia personnel. In late April 1945, American forces occupying the region near Augsburg learned of the euthanasia center at Kaufbeuren. They actually learned, as Allied troops did in many other locations, from the local population who had long-time suspicions about the facility. And they came and arrested some of the leading officials at the facility. On the 29th of May, an American Army Medical Corps unit revisiting the institution in order to reprovision it. There were still living patients in that facility that could not be released, and they were making sure it had adequate provisions and that the patients were well. They made a gruesome discovery. 21 days following the end of war in the European theater, and 31 days after Kaufbeuren had been liberated, Kaufbeuren nurses were still killing their patients. The last dying by lethal overdose just hours before the soldiers' arrival for inspection. The recent recognition among scholars that hunger deaths accounted for a far greater number of euthanasia victims than we originally assumed in our studies, as well as the evidence that the entrenched nature of the killing process among Kaufbeuren staff was particularly strong in that they murdered patients long after they had the mandate to do so, are two particularly compelling reasons to take a closer look at the nature of euthanasia practices at Kaufbeuren as seen through these patient and administrative records. First, I want to say a few words about who these individuals were before they came to Kaufbeuren, and that's something we can tell from these medical records. Patients in this sample, about 500 patients. The record group is arranged, for those of you in the historians community that might be listening to this lecture tonight, the record group was arranged alphabetically, so this is a random sample. 53% of that sample were women, 47% were men. There was sufficient regional distribution of patients among the sample. Given the facility's location near the city of Augsburg, it's scarcely surprising that about 40% of the patients came from the state of Bavaria, and that a full quarter of that number, full quarter of the patients in the survey were from the local governing district of Swabia itself, so the local region itself. While the remaining portion of the sample came from every corner of the German Reich, a significant number of individuals derived from three principal areas: from Hanover in northern Germany, from Baden in southwestern Germany, and what is today the third place, Rhineland-Westphalia, so the northwestern area along the Rhine River. The relatively large percentages of persons from distant areas of the country owe to the fact that patients often arrived at Kaufbeuren in collective transports from established, what were called transit facilities, institutions that served as a kind of way station, supplying a regular influx of patients for killing and concealing their fates from suspicious relatives and responsible agencies, for example, their insurance companies. The sizable numbers of diverse patients from diverse regions of the Reich is good for historians like me, because it means it lends validity to the sample by ensuring we don't have a Bavarian patient model, but a wider model from the German Reich as a whole. In terms of religious confession, there was an almost even mix among patients. 45% were Protestant, almost 53% were Roman Catholic. There were no Jews at this time. Jews had begun to be deported from the Reich in October of 1941, and so by this time there were almost no Jews on German soil, by the time Kaufbeuren was a euthanasia facility of any note. Not surprisingly, most of these individuals stem from the working and lower middle classes, from parental households engaged in farming, as artisans or shop owners, or as factory workers. Because most neurological disorders and instances of retardation are discovered in infancy or early childhood, right? And since the onset of most mental illnesses begin in your late teen years or early adulthood, it's not surprising that almost a full 3/4 of individuals housed at Kaufbeuren remained unmarried. An almost equal percentage had no children. In keeping with the general population, few individuals here attended school beyond a primary education. That was pretty common in the local population as well. Only 16% advanced beyond the cursory education to apprenticeships or vocational training. A full 23% had no schooling whatsoever, either because they were small children when they died at the facility or because they had been deemed ineducable. They didn't have the kind of mainstreaming or special education in those days that they do today, and so many of these patients just simply were shut out of possibilities to go to school. Lack of education and training, combined with the early appearance of illness or disorders, meant that a sizable number of the victim pool never exercised a trade or profession of any kind. Only a small percentage before they were committed as patients, as artisans, as skilled labor, as office workers, business persons, service personnel, jobs that would have required some training. Still, a much smaller percentage of the total had low-end jobs, like unskilled factory workers, manual or day laborers, miners, all from the Rhineland, transport workers, and farmhands. Of course, the married women in our survey, if they were married, that was actually seen as a profession. At the time, that was their status at least, and so they were listed as wives. And so they had some kind of official status. That was their career, so to speak. So they number as wives in the survey. Indeed, even if they'd exercised some kind of profession before their marriage. And in those cases, I did try to single out those individuals who'd worked before they were married and put their statistical information on what they'd done into the survey. So this kind of data gleaned from medical records can give us kind of sociological data about the victims, who they were as people behind the statistics. But at the same time, a careful reading of these euthanasia patient files can reveal or confirm a number of important details regarding the functioning of killing centers like Kaufbeuren as it evolved as a particular institution. And let me demonstrate this through a case history. And the first, I don't have photographs of these individuals because for the most part, when they're photographed naked, and so I want to preserve the patient's privacy by not showing those. I'm sorry I don't have photographs to illustrate these case histories this evening. Lawrence Bauer was born in Stadtbergen, Bavaria, to peasant farmers on the 24th of August, 1883. He had a normal schooling, and at the age of 18, he entered a brief compulsory military service. After his discharge, his family remarked on the young man's changed character, and in 1912, the 20-year-old Bauer began to manifest the first symptoms of schizophrenia. In July of that year, he was committed to the Kaufbeuren facility. It was a local facility for him on the order of police authorities. But he improved sufficiently in a few months to be released to the custody of his brother. Bauer had earlier been apprenticed as a bricklayer, as a mason, and he now moved to Augsburg to exercise his trade. Things went well into the summer of 1920 when Lawrence Bauer again began to demonstrate violent behavior, threatening his brother with an axe. For the second time, in 1921, he was admitted to Kaufbeuren as a danger to himself and the community, and that's the wording that's generally used. A longtime patient at the facility, Bauer worked for many of his 24 years at Kaufbeuren as a field hand, and despite a few disruptive episodes, was singled out in 1942 by hospital officials as one of the most diligent workers in the woodyard. In 1943, Bauer expressed remorse to nursing staff because a foot injury kept him from working out of doors. When the swelling in his foot reoccurred in late 1944, Bauer complained to his attending physician that he could neither thrive nor recover sufficiently to go back to work since he did not receive adequate rations as a non-worker. the injury lingered, and within a few weeks' time, Bauer was transferred to the Irsee wing of the facility, where he was murdered by a lethal overdose of medication. A careful reading of these files, as I've said, can indicate or confirm things that we've guessed about the functioning of killing centers in general, and about the process of how euthanasia develops at a specific facility in particular. In the case of Mr. Bauer, it indicates something historians have known for a long time about the euthanasia program, that the ability to work represented an important factor in including or excluding individual patients from the killing measure. Undeniably, in both phases of adult euthanasia, in the gassing phase, which I described earlier, and from 1942 to 1945, the killing phase through lethal overdose of medications, as it was practiced at Kaufbeuren, the criterion of labor could establish a reprieve for patients as useful workers or doom them to the destruction process. Administrators clearly placed an emphasis on retaining those patients able to labor at the facility. Those who could work received extra rations. Hunger and medication confined the incapacitated to their beds and worked as a twin dynamic to reduce the strength and resolve of patients until their purposeless existence, as the Nazis described them, was cut short by malnutrition, disease, or overdose of narcotics. The other factor which Lawrence Bauer illustrates is the issue of long-term patients living at euthanasia facilities. One thing that struck me as I began to analyze the statistics, the statistical data that I gathered from the individual files to make this preliminary report, was that a full third of the persons in this study, 33% of 500 cases, had been committed to a mental health facility for 1 year or less when they met their deaths at Kaufbeuren. Before November of 1942, the euthanasia program's registration process, remember we saw that registration form at the beginning of my talk, the euthanasia registration process had set a kind of standard by including generally those who had lived at a certain institution for 5 years or more. Thus, they were focusing on persons at certain institutions who had lived there and were consigned there for long-term care. They're looking for, quote-unquote, incurable patients. Clearly now, as the killing program radicalized, and it really did so in 1944 and 1945, Kaufbeuren personnel had fewer compunctions, fewer problems about killing less impaired individuals or individuals who had a reasonable chance of recovery. Those individuals who had been committed to a mental health facility for only a relatively short time frame, and they included these individuals with so-called incurables in the destruction process. There were, of course, individuals like Lawrence Bauer who lived at Kaufbeuren for a long time. He lived there 24 years, if you'll remember. Some of them, before the institution, became a euthanasia facility, and he fits the pattern of individuals like this very closely. Only 10% of Kaufbeuren patients that I had in this sample belonged to the circle of long-term patients, housed at the facility for 5 years or more, and that was my rule. In the 1930s, in the 1920s, let's begin there, it wasn't uncommon for patients to live years and years and years at one facility, but in the 1930s, the Nazis began to work to concentrate patients in larger facilities and to move them around a bit as cost-saving measures. And so by that time, it was relatively rare for patients to be in a facility for more than 5 years at one time, also because of the way that the euthanasia program began to function after 1940. So only, as I said, 10% of Kaufbeuren patients had actually lived at that facility for more than 5 years when I looked at this survey. And these individuals are very interesting, and there are two important aspects connected with them. First, long-term patients comprise a significant number of those who survived Kaufbeuren as a killing site. There were several hundred patients who were liberated when the facility was liberated in April of 1945. This suggests that those patients had been retained, as historians have long suspected, because they were good workers. Kaufbeuren, like many facilities in Germany in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, employed patient labor at the facility for menial tasks mainly, a concept which was thought therapeutic for the patient, and economically advantageous for the institution as a whole, particularly in the harsh years of the Great Depression and Germany's economic problems in the 1920s. So this was fairly common in the 1920s and 30s, 40s in German institutions. Long-term patients survived too when they proved to be of minimal trouble for caretakers and they required little care, or because they had champions among the personnel, the staff at the hospital, who viewed them as kind of pets, pet patients. Likewise, many long-term patients were locals, like Lawrence Bauer from Augsburg and the surrounding countryside, who had been committed to Kaufbeuren directly. That is to say, they had not been brought in transports selected for the euthanasia program, but were admitted directly by their families or some kind of authority, local authority to those hospitals. And these individuals, like Lawrence Bauer, received frequent visits from friends and loved ones. And many historians speculate that the abrupt disappearance of these kind of individuals might have raised doubts among family members, and perhaps these individuals were spared in order to avoid and avert local suspicion. It's extremely interesting to note that many of these long-term patients live until the very last months of the war and then are killed in large numbers in March and April of 1945 before American troops overran the facility. They die in exquisitely large numbers in those months, and it's a surprising trend. Unlike Lawrence Bauer, Maria Dorpelin spent a very brief time at Kaufbeuren. On the evening of 2nd of March 1944, a transport of 8 elderly individuals arrived at the facility. Among these patients were several residents of the Albertusheim, an old age home which had been damaged, like the ladies that we saw at the beginning of my talk, during the bombing of Augsburg in February of 1944, so a week earlier. This little group appeared at the institution well ahead of their medical and administrative records, and although most had rudimentary identity papers on them when they arrived, one female remained unidentified. This elderly woman stroked the arms of the nurses very kindly who helped her into her bed, but had very little information to share with caregivers as far as her own personal information or the names of family members. She was diagnosed with arteriosclerosis and confined to her bed with restraints. As with so many elderly Kaufbeuren patients, incontinence and the need for constant care proved a death sentence. And on the 15th of March, 1944, this still nameless woman was murdered with a lethal overdose of medication. In the days that followed, her records arrived, and Kaufbeuren staff were able finally to identify the dead woman as Maria Dorpelin, born to a tax assessor in the city of Taus, Bohemia, today in the Czech Republic, in 1870. The 73-year-old woman had been a long, active, and productive member of the community of Dillingen on the Danube in Bavaria, where her husband, the late Hofrat Friedrich Dorpelin, had been the former mayor. In her widowhood, she had been a quiet and orderly retirement home resident. Once at Kaufbeuren, she was dead in 2 weeks. Maria Dorpelin's history raises a significant detail in this narrative. It is true that although dissimilar in many aspects from T4's gassing phase, that time between 1940 and 1941 when gassing was employed, this euthanasia campaign, as it was carried out at Kaufbeuren with overdoses of medication and starvation, targeted chiefly the same victims that the earlier program had, namely the institutionalized mentally and physically disabled. Not surprisingly, schizophrenia, epilepsy, and hereditary feeble-mindedness. This was a large sort of umbrella diagnosis for what we today, or at least doctors and maybe in our audience, would recognize as a wide spectrum of developmental and cognitive disabilities. These schizophrenia, epilepsy, and hereditary feeble-mindedness form the chief reasons that people were committed to the Kaufbeuren facility during any time period. Strikingly, however, the next highest percentage of diagnoses at committal among the murdered patients at the facility were arteriosclerosis at 7.6% and dementia, senile dementia, both impairments of old age. In fact, the number of geriatric deaths in proportion to the congregate mortality statistics were the most unsettling discovery I encountered in regard to these Kaufbeuren files. To be clear, 56% of those people who are murdered at Kaufbeuren are between 1941 and 1945 fell under the proper rubric of euthanasia. They were persons in their majority who sometime after the age of 18 suffered from some kind of severe mental or physical disability. As Kaufbeuren was also an infamous site of child euthanasia, it's totally expected that there was a significant percentage of young victims. 18% of the victims who died at Kaufbeuren were small children or juveniles up to the age of 18. As I said, 209 people in total. But 16%, almost 17% of this sample of 500 people that I've looked at represented geriatric victims. Individuals suffering from an infirmity like old age, senility, disorientation, stroke, or the cognitive impairment that we associate today with Alzheimer's disease, without other pathology relating to mental illness or physical disability. It should be noted that in March of 1941, Karl Brandt and Philip Buhler, those I hate to call them gentlemen, whom I showed on the screen earlier, the planners of the euthanasia program had set strict guidelines which effectively banned individuals, doctors, from assigning elderly patients without any other kind of pathology, so geriatric patients who had senile dementia, into the euthanasia program. They were not supposed to be included in this unless they had a prior, as a younger person, they had prior signs of mental illness. Among Kaufbeuren's geriatric victims, like Maria Dorpalen or the ladies that I introduced the talk with, were elderly victims of Allied bombing raids on cities like Dresden or Augsburg, or evacuees from the East who were temporarily housed in lazarettes, hospitals, or welfare institutions for observation, or until relatives could come and collect them. And under the auspices of something called Operation Brandt, named for Karl Brandt, whom you saw earlier, the planner of euthanasia, and incidentally, as you probably saw from Dr. Groden's talk, if you were there on Tuesday, the chief defendant at the Nuremberg doctors' trials. So this Operation Brandt synchronized the euthanasia program with local and regional disaster planning. So when you have a bombing in the area and you need bed space, you have a lack of bed space for valuable individuals like civilians or military personnel who have been injured, municipal authorities simply took geriatric patients out of old age facilities, used the beds for these more valuable individuals, and sent individuals like Maria Dorpalen and the ladies that we saw in the beginning of this talk to euthanasia sites like Kaufbeuren. The case history of Walter Graf illuminates a final point. In early childhood, Graf developed encephalitis, that's an inflammation of the brain, and as a young boy thereafter, he suffered frequent epileptic seizures. Graf was 8 when he was committed to the Rotenburg Sanatorium near Hanover. In his late teens, he developed sufficient skills to work as a cobbler in the Rotenburg facility, and in 1938, his caretakers noted that this was a young man who was mischievous and loved to play practical jokes on his fellow patients, but in the workshop where he worked, in the cobbler workshop where he worked, he was quiet, industrious, and efficient. At this juncture, Graf stood 5'8", and he weighed 145 pounds. He had always been in excellent health, but in 1941, he began to suffer more and more frequent epileptic seizures. As his physical condition deteriorated, he found it difficult to work, and in 1943, he was selected for transfer to Kaufbeuren. For a few months, he managed to work in the garden, but his new special diet, as the staff called it, left him weak and incontinent. In the last month of his life, subjected to a starvation diet, Walter Graf lost nearly 10 kilograms, 22 pounds in 4 weeks. When he died on the 27th of March, 1944, he was 32 years old and weighed 70 pounds. And just this is a disturbing image, so many of you, I won't leave it on the screen for long, but this is one of the patients found in 1945 when American troops overran the facilities. There are hundreds of these photographs of emaciated patients, which I'll talk about right now. Walter Graf was one of those Kaufbeuren patients who suffered a languishing death by starvation. Originally, when I began this project, I wondered how I'd be able to establish how individuals died. I knew that they were using two methods of killing at Kaufbeuren: starvation of patients and also lethal overdoses of medication. But what I hadn't counted on was really the invaluable cooperation of Kaufbeuren personnel at the time, who kept accurate weight charts, monthly weight charts for each individual. And according to the available documentation, 23% of Kaufbeuren victims in my sample of 500 died through direct starvation. In 20% of the cases, the duration of their stay was so short that it was obvious that they'd been murdered by lethal overdoses of medication, like Maria Ndorpalin, who was dead within 2 weeks. Sometimes it's very clear that the shortness of the stay combined with the weight loss, the very rapid weight loss that you could see in the weight charts, indicated that those two things worked in tandem to kill the patient. And in nearly half of the cases, there was just inadequate evidence to determine a cause of death. And let me get this off the screen there. Obviously, the data I'm presenting this evening is sort of preliminary outline of issues which I want to continue to explore as I go through these patient records. In analyzing Kaufbeuren patient material. They're very rare documents for an historian to have. I'm very grateful to have been able to have access to them. This is still a work in progress, and it's occurring in many places. There's another group near Frankfurt that's working on similar patient records to try and get analysis of who these individuals were. But we're getting some feelings for who these patients were and what they suffered at the hands of their tormentors. We recognize, for example, that the relatively high percentage of geriatric victims without significant pathology deviates really from our standard assumption that the euthanasia program claim the lives only of severely mentally and physically disabled patients because they ostensibly compromise Germany's genetic and economic resources. Likewise, the murder of elderly bombing victims, largely under the aegis of Operation Brant, that operation I've just explained, suggests that the exigencies of total war had widened the arc of intolerance for those unable to provide and care for themselves, rendering human life in the last years of the war more and more dispensable. Both instances clearly point out the fact that as the euthanasia program spiraled out of control, and it really did so in the years 1944 and 1945, including foreign forced laborers among its victim count, bombing victims, as we've seen, German frontline soldiers who had traumatic head wounds or psychiatric disturbances as a result of their service at the front. So ordinary Germans, too, increasingly, ordinary in quotations here, were caught up in this cycle of destruction. In the final months, T4's deadly machinery seemed to spin out of control, extending its web to all potential drains on essential goods and services. These reflections introduce as many questions as they seem to answer. For example, when did it happen that T4 expanded beyond the slaying of life unworthy of life, that's what the Nazis called these individuals, to murder those who were no longer useful to the community at large, even if their condition were treatable or if it didn't have an hereditary or psychiatric basis? Why did the killing increase dramatically for both long-term patients and for patients in general at war's end? And is this something we can associate with what historians like to call crimes of the end phase of the war, where you have a dramatic sort of uptick in killings of the civilian population in Germany as a whole? What about the idea of calculated starvation at some of these facilities as a more organic means of killing? Was this a way for the staff at Kaufbeuren and other facilities that practice this to distance themselves from their patients? And is this part of the reason that killings extended at Kaufbeuren after the facility had been liberated? These are points for further discussion and research. A dialogue which helps to explain the contours of Nazi euthanasia policy is ultimately a dialogue about its victims. And here the victims, though silenced, still have a lot to tell us. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I guess I'll be taking some questions now. Thank you. Are there Other questions? Jeff, you want me to take them, or you? Okay. Questions? Sure. Just hold on a second. I'm going to put on my glasses. Go ahead and answer your question.
You mentioned the parallels or the connections between the gassing of the euthanasia victims and the use of gas in the Holocaust. Was there a parallel between the use of starvation to kill euthanasia victims and the use of that in the military campaign in the East?
Yeah, that's an interesting. Right, that's an interesting question. Does anybody need me to repeat the question? The acoustics are pretty good in here. Is there a connection? I mean, there's definitely a development in the gassing, as you've pointed out, and that the gassing technology that's actually employed for the final solution, specifically in places like Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, the camps I mentioned this evening, are directly developed from the euthanasia program and elaborated upon by the planners of the final solution when they decide to gas Jews in large numbers. And so there's a direct technological link there as far as the gassing is concerned. And I'm glad you brought that up. I don't have time to mention all of the sort of basic things about the euthanasia program, but that's a very important point. I don't think there's as much of a, are you hearing me with the lavalier? Are you good back there? Can I kind of walk across? I don't think there's such a connection with the starvation. That was not that common. It's increasingly, we're seeing it happen in more facilities than we first knew about. But in some of these facilities, that was actually an ad hoc decision of the local doctor. In some places, it wasn't. In Bavarian institution, it was actually the secret policy of the institutions that could participate in the euthanasia program. I think it isn't connected, at least, I mean, in a very direct way, to the starvation of, say, concentration camp victims. But more importantly, I think you're alluding here to Soviet prisoners of war who died in extraordinarily large numbers, as high as 3 million. Dead Soviet prisoners of war. They're not very often thought of. They're just basically left, these individuals are captured, they're put in a space, a confined space with no medical attention and almost no resources or food, and just simply left to starve to death or die through exposure or through disease. And I mean, it's a similar kind of concept. These individuals were just simply not necessary, and the German army didn't want to feed them. That's at least part of the rationale, but I don't think they're connected. It's an interesting thought, though. Thank you for bringing it up.
You had mentioned insurance, the insurance company.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I was curious, first of all,
I planted him. No, I didn't. Go ahead.
How common is life insurance, among families there? Now, I take it what was going on, of course, was that they were trying to keep this, make these deaths look natural.
Exactly.
But I mean, didn't the insurance companies then become curious about what was going on in that house, and how was that hushed out?
Right. What's a very interesting and little known fact about the euthanasia program is that it was a self-supporting industry. A lot of the money came, and very few people, because we're looking at how doctors participate in this, we're looking at the ethics, the medical ethics that are connected with this, and not many people ask, where's the money going? And one of those people who've actually done that, and most of the money came through party subventions. It came from the party office. But this was an outgrowth of the actual camouflage effort. They want to camouflage these deaths. These deaths are occurring on German soil. They don't want anyone to know about them. They're not briefing German agencies, including the Justice Department, which causes a lot of trouble later on. They're not briefing private agencies. Those people who find out through the grapevine. And they don't find out through people actually telling them about this. And one of the things that they figure out to do is a camouflage tactic. Okay, you're getting a transport of 100 people from a certain hospital. And that's commonly how they did it. They brought 100 people from a certain hospital in a certain region. Moreover, they concentrate region by region. And this gets a lot of trouble. It gets you in for a lot of trouble because people whose relatives are in certain facility might know other people who has relatives in the same facility. They might have seen them in the hall or struck up a conversation with them. And people begin to talk. Hey, my son died in Hartheim too. My aunt died there. It's very strange. And so the sort of development department of the T4 campaign decides what we're going to do. We're going to put a big map in our central office, and we're going to stagger out death dates for these individuals so that that 100 people from a certain region don't die at the same time. And that makes a lot of sense. But what the directors of the euthanasia program quickly find is they can take the per diem expenses for these individuals and put them in their account. And for the most part, the German state is actually paying for this. Because most of these individuals in the social welfare network. We know that since the Bismarck era, Germany's had a pretty good safety net. They have basically health insurance. And these individuals, most of them have been in facilities for a long time, and they're in that. And so the money comes from the taxpayer, really, to fund this. But in some cases, there were people who paid for their own upkeep, wealthy individuals, or their business insurance paid, their AOK, their Allgemeine Ortskrankenkasse, their business insurance, their private insurance, paid for these things. And by stringing out the dates, not only do you camouflage it, but you rake in a little bit of money. And they did this in extreme ways when they murdered elements of the German Jewish population. About 5,000 German Jews were murdered before German Jews began to be deported. And what they did was they told the Jewish community, the centralized Jewish community, that they'd sent these patients to a place called Kolm in Poland, German-occupied Poland, and that they were all there. And slowly, the relatives and the Jewish community gets notes back, as do the families of other euthanasia victims. These individuals have died in that facility of some natural cause, like pneumonia or heart disease. And what they did was murder these individuals on German soil, say that they'd murdered them in Poland, and taken an enormous payment from the Jewish community for their upkeep. It's a very interesting thing. And yes, insurance, but what could they do, right? It's also a terror state. People who talk about this, it depends on who they say things to, but you've got to be careful. People who talk about this, just a normal insurance agent or someone like this, you might wind up in a concentration camp for a while. And that's what they tended to do with people, locals, who talked about the facilities loudly to their neighbors. I know of a woman who was sent to Ravensbrück for a few months. And then she was allowed to come back and tell everyone that you shouldn't keep your mouth shut, or else you'll wind up in one of these terrible places. And so they didn't say a lot. They paid the premiums. But it's a very interesting aspect of the euthanasia program, and one that people don't get to hear about very often. So I thank you for your question and your sharp ears. Yes, I'll get you, and then, I'm sorry, let me get this young lady back here, and then you.
Sure, so in your talk, it sounds like the complicity and levels of planning really go all the way up and down, from the top doctors
Yes.
to the nurses and orderlies.
Yes.
I'm wondering, how much do you know about the staff at these various facilities and what becomes of them after the program is concluded?
That's a very good question, and it changes as the process changes. From the very beginning of the euthanasia program, people were actually, nurses and doctors at the beginning were specifically recruited. They were people that were thought to be often party members, people whom individuals believed to be politically reliable, who could be quiet about a secret program on German soil. They were brought to Berlin and made to sign a privacy oath, an oath of silence, before they were told what was happening. And they were actually, as we know from at least one nurse, that they were actually given the choice to participate or not. And we know that certain people refused and were very fearful after they refused, but nothing happened to these individuals. They had enough individuals who were willing to participate. And so at the very beginning, they recruit these staffs, and they bring them actually in places like Heberer. When they decide this is going to be a killing center, they take out the patients, put them somewhere else, and they turn it into a killing center. There are very few patients living at that facility except on their manor at some of these workshops, because the facility needs to keep functioning. It's kind of factory existence. And there's the regular staff, and they kind of are sitting on their hands while these doctors, they're called the Berliners, come in and run this euthanasia program. But that's only at first. By the time you get towards the end of 1941, more of those people are being brought into the killing process. And when the program decentralizes from 42 to 45, and you have this process happening in a whole bunch of facilities throughout Germany and Austria, they actually don't recruit anyone. They say, this facility, you, Kaufbeuren, you're going to become a euthanasia facility. And the staff they're brought into a room and told, this is what you're going to do. And you can imagine the range of responses if you heard that. You might think, great, I think that's a great idea, if you were that kind of individual. But a lot of them, thought, ooh, what about that? What about the legal implications? I can't do that. That's against my moral conscience. But surprisingly, most people went along. But they're not recruited like they are in the beginning. And that's one of the interesting things, because you really are many of you familiar with Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men? How many are familiar with that? A lot of you history guys back there, right? It's the idea that you don't need indoctrination. These were not SS people who shot Jews. They were an ordinary police battalion from Hamburg. And the idea is, and I think that fits this argument, Chris Browning's argument, these people weren't indoctrinated. They were brought into a program, whether they liked it or not, and most of them simply went along. It's very interesting. And thank you for the question, because it gives me a chance to explain that. You had a question, Madame.
Yes, I was going to ask, you know how they had to fill out the questionnaire? Is there any proof that what they wrote is true? Because what if they just, like there was somebody who was talking too much or whatever, they wanted gone and wasn't disabled and wasn't mentally disabled?
Well, thank you. You guys are hitting all the points tonight. A good audience. Because in fact, this did happen in two different ways. As I said, when these questionnaires first came out, they're not briefing medical directors about what this is for, and the questionnaire is made to look like a program that's going to gather statistical data. And at the beginning of this process, medical directors began to look at this and they thought, the war has started. This is a way to take away our less impaired patients for labor. And we don't want that, because most facilities ran on a little bit of patient labor, as I explained. And so they thought, we don't want to do that. So I'm going to report my least impaired patients as being the most impaired so we can keep them. And so at the beginning of the process, you see, by the accounts of the doctors who briefly look over these individuals, large numbers of relatively unimpaired patients coming to be killed. And the same thing happens in reverse, the kind of situation you describe. People report individuals because they're, and absolutely so, because they're troublesome patients, because they soil their beds, because they make trouble for the authorities, because they bother the other patients. And by the time that the medical directors understand what the questionnaire is for, they use it in that way. And so both of those scenarios are possible and happened. So it's not just the very impaired patients, it's patients who cause trouble. And at the very beginning, unfortunately, large numbers of relatively unimpaired patients that had depression, people who had been there at the facility for a short time, despite the guidelines that were given to these medical directors. It's an interesting issue. Yes, ma'am?
So that some people were long-term instructors, what would they decide if you're running long-term? Was it like a severity of you're like...
Right. I mean, I think it's not as common today to be institutionalized, right? Because you can't institutionalize someone against their will anymore, thank goodness, I guess. But in those days, it was usually the severity of the disorder that the patient had, or the mental illness that the patients had. And they did try to release patients. And what's very interesting, I think, is that Kaufman releases patients that get better. And I think it's a juxtaposition of healing and killing. They're taking in patients at the facility, they're treating patients at the facility, and they're also killing patients at the facility. It's a very interesting kind of juxtaposition of healing and killing. That's the part of the history that we historians like to talk about. But really, it's just as it would be today, the severity of a person's illness or disability, very serious cognitive impairment, what people call retardation, very serious physical, people who are paralyzed and things like these. These who make up long-term patients, schizophrenia and so forth. So I think that's a sign. I'll move over.
Part of the fascinating thing that's coming out of this research is, on the one hand, putting a face on the victims, which we really haven't known very much about up till now, simply rough statistics, finding out what sorts of people were the victims of this program. But as you've listened to this, you can imagine how large the number of perpetrators was, of a bureaucracy that moved patients across Germany from one facility to another, bureaucrats that are keeping track of these people, nurses, physicians, people who are deciding about food or not food, that often one has thought about these facilities in terms of a small number of doctors or nurses who are actively injecting lethal drugs or something of that sort. This kind of research is showing that the number of members of the medical profession in Germany that participated in this enormous program is really much larger than we thought. And this is really one of the results of this new research, which is going on, in which Dr. Heberer is one of the researchers. So I really want to thank you very much for your presentation. I thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope we will see you next Tuesday again. So, thanks a lot.